just to start the class off, I like to remind you guys, as well as anybody who ultimately watches this in its recorded state, that you know, the Chuck Jones Center for Creativity is a nonprofit organization. We rely on donations to keep all of our teachers, as well as producers and technicians, involved in this. So feel free to make a donation of any size at chuckjones.org. chuckjones.org. You'll also find a library of classes that have been featured over the course of the entire center's history. And you can always reference any material back in time through our archive. With that, Scott has put up the link to the chuckjones.org site for that reason. Okay, getting into today's class, we're going to continue on the theme for the month of July for my class, which is called Broadcast Graphics. This is an area of animation that oftentimes is not very well taught, if taught at all, in school. Oftentimes, character animation and storytelling are taught in schools, but the area of broadcast graphics and motion graphics is usually not taught. It is taught in some trade schools, but not taught in general, either public schools or private schools. So with that, today we're going to get into two areas of broadcast graphics that are very important. One is the area of typography. If you don't know what typography is, it's the study of type design. And type design is the design of typographic characters. Believe it or not, A, B, C, D, E, F, all the numbers and letters of the alphabet are considered characters in typography. And the study of typography is important when dealing with graphics, whether it's print graphics or, in our case, motion graphic and broadcast graphics, because typography can tell a lot about a particular brand's personality. Oftentimes, kids' personalities or kids' channels will have a more playful form of typography, while something more serious and adult, like let's say a news channel, will have typography that is more slick and crisp and kind of classic in its nature. And all of these different typographical treatments are what make up the library of a brand, a particular brand. In our case, in broadcast, it deals with networks such as CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, and also channels such as the Disney Channel, Discovery Channel, History Channel, A&E. And in the case of streaming services, which are now becoming very popular, we're talking about brands like Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, HBO, etc. So as we start to get into the area of broadcast graphics, we are trying to reiterate to an audience that all of this programming that you're receiving is coming to you from one specific network or one specific streaming service or one specific channel. So we want to be able to brand that on the screen so that people remind themselves that, oh, the reason I'm watching this great program on elephants is because it's being brought to me by the National Geographic Channel, as an example. Okay. So with today's class, I'm going to go through several samples, as I did in our last class, showing you examples of some of the things that I and my teams work on in order to create typographical and branding solutions for networks. Okay. So before we do that, I just want to let you guys know we are going to be seeing some drawing in the later part of the class today, and you're going to need some supplies to kind of play along. Okay. So with that, Scott, let's highlight the down shooter here. So the first thing you're going to need is a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper. And on that paper, you're going to need to make 3 frames here. A beginning frame, a middle frame, and an end frame. And with this, we're going to storyboard an example of a broadcast graphic using typography. So we're going to, our little story, which will probably be no more than a second, maybe 2 seconds, maybe even only no longer than 3 seconds. That little story is going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there's a high likelihood that the end is going to be the brand, the actual logo of the network or the channel or the streaming service. So the question is, what is the story that we're going to tell that's going to end up in that specific graphic? Okay. Along with that, you're going to need some drawing tools. You're going to need a pencil, just like this, a classic 2B pencil that you use in school and things. You're going to need a really good eraser. In this case, I have a Staedtler Mars refillable eraser. As you can see here, I can put a new little bit of an eraser into the holder and then lock it in place like so. You're also going to need a Sharpie to make your boxes. Your boxes should ideally be in what's called a 3:4 ratio, aspect ratio we call it. That means it's typically 4 inches long by 3 inches tall. 4 inches long by 3 inches tall. That creates a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is pretty typical for broadcast graphics. Okay? And the last thing you're going to need is a straight edge. You can either have a straight edge like this, which is a classic ruler, or, hold on, I'm going to grab something else here. A really good tool to have when drawing is a ruler, or sorry, a triangle. And that triangle is typically clear, so you can see through it as you're drawing your straight edges. Okay? So those are the tools we're going to need today later in class for our drawing part of it. Okay? I'm going to set these aside, and I'm going to ask Scott to cue up our first graphic. Okay, and Scott, yeah, can we make that full screen? Awesome. So guys, when we talk about branding and we talk about network identity, being able to identify the channel, the network, or the streaming service you're watching, it's typically done through a logo. All those services have classic logos. This one in particular is the CBS network. It's the Columbia Broadcasting Service. It's what CBS stands for, the Columbia Broadcast Service. And as you can see, their logo is a play on an I. And it's done by a very famous graphic designer named Lou Dorfman. And Lou was a particularly good designer in the 50s who designed this logo, 50 and 60s, who designed this logo for CBS. To me, it's one of the most beautiful logos I've ever seen. And I often refer to it when I'm teaching classes about logo design. So CBS has a logo, and they typically have what's called the tagline. The tagline is what runs along the bottom, and it's laid out in type, and it says, "Welcome home." Basically, the theme for CBS when this piece was produced was we were trying to get audience back to network television, because a lot of the audience was going to cable television. And we wanted to welcome viewers back to the trusted brand of CBS. So our tagline was "Welcome home. Come back. Find safety, security, and truthful information at CBS." So with that, Scott, let's advance on to the next frame. Here's another example of logo treatment that you'll see on air. In this case, you've got the CBS logo, the tagline "Welcome home," and then you've got some interesting graphics that most likely move in the background. Let's move on to the next one, Scott. Here's another example of a graphic version of the CBS logo done as another potential tagline, which is "Eye on the net." Basically, we want to make sure that CBS is not only going to be broadcast, but is also going to be available on the streaming services that are available on the internet. Okay, with that, we'll move on, Scott. So as you guys can see, some of the storyboards that I and my teams put together are examples of how can we tell a quick story about CBS that is only going to last a few seconds. It probably is not going to be longer than 3 seconds long. And the idea is to have a clever, memorable animation that people go, oh, that's going to be CBS, or wow, that's cool how CBS managed to make its logo out of things that I would have never expected. So as you can see in this storyboard, I'm starting the animation with things that are very unusual, in particular, taking the building blocks of the logo and turning them on their edges. So I'm looking down on the parts rather than looking straight on at them, and I'm letting them rotate in animation to create the CBS logo, which is at the end frame. So there's a beginning frame and an end frame. You would never know from just looking at the beginning frame and the end frame that they're connected, that they have any connection to each other. But when you animate and draw out the middle frames, the middle of the story, you see how that beginning story and that end story are connected by what happens in the middle. Okay? And that's all conveyed through a storyboard. And that's why we're going to spend some time at the end of the class to work on a storyboard. All right? The more complex your animation is, the more frames you're going to need in your storyboard, because it's going to take more frames to explain the complexity of that animation to your animator, the person who's actually going to animate this either by hand or else in the computer. All right. So with that, Scott, let's move on to the next example. Here's some other examples of 3-frame storyboards that you can tell the story in just 3 frames as to what the essence of that story is going to be. So you can see in the top one, there's streaking lines coming towards the camera. The camera swings around and looks straight down on those streaking lines running left to right. And embedded in there is the CBS logo. The second one is some typography that starts close to the camera and then animates backwards. In other words, the camera is pulling away from the objects to reveal what their story is. And then finally, the last one is kind of an architectural rendition where we may start with the CBS logo and then go backwards in its construction. Show how the construction started as something very unusual and resolved itself to the CBS logo. Okay, with that, I'm gonna come out of CBS and talk a little bit about another brand that you guys are all familiar with, or maybe you're not, actually. It's a little bit older, but it was an early internet brand called AOL, America Online. And you can see here that they were coming up with a service called AOL Plus, meaning AOL in addition to something else that they had. And they were branding themselves as AOL Plus. So we went through exploring several different logo examples here. And you can see them stacked top to bottom. So every single one of those is a different rendition, a different idea around the name AOL Plus. Okay? And I want you guys to see that oftentimes in logo design, we will do a lot of work in typography and in black and white. We don't go to color first. Rather, we work in black and white, and we try to make up what we call a high contrast solution, a solution that works in black and white. And then the next phase after that is to start dealing with color. But first, it has to work in black and white. Okay, with that, Scott, we'll move on to the next one. And you can see that this is the solution that AOL started to like, which was a very flat AOL logo and AOL typography with a 3-dimensional plus sign, very similar to the Microsoft gaming platform. So that's the look that they started to actually enjoy and like. And then I think there's one more here, Scott. This is some examples of what I call early thumbnail sketching. This is very, very early sketching that I do to start laying out what a frame will look like. So I do this in very rough form, as you can see. My lines are very squiggly. I've got a lot of notations. I am drawing out the beginnings of the typography, so you can see the word news. News is laid out in the screen. These are all ultimately going to become screens for the broadcast network, but you can see that I stayed really rough. You like to stay rough and very sketchy form at first, and then you tighten up from there. All right, Scott, let's move on to the next brand, which is BT, otherwise known as British Telecom. It's a British telephone company in London, and they were coming up with a new service called BT Express, which was their version of an online television network delivered by the telephone company rather than delivered by a broadcast company. So you can see here that we once again explore many different examples of how the BT brand can be expanded to include BT Express. So you'll see that we've got some imagery of birds, we got some imagery of X's, got an outline of a television screen, arrows, etc. Let's go on to the next one, Scott. And as you can see here, further explorations, all with the interest of them being able to brand the new service called BT Express, British Telecom Express. Okay, I'm going to show you some motion of a website. One of the projects that we had to do for British Telecom was, aside from also designing their brand, BT Express, we had to move that brand into the website, their website. And so we started to include animation in the website so that it felt more television-like. There was motion. It wasn't just a flat, static site, but rather a site that involved motion. And oftentimes motion is used very good for transitions. So you're going from one screen to another, or you're building a screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about another entertainment brand called Entertainer. You probably have not heard of that. But Scott, could we move on to frame 11?
Yes.
So guys, I wanted to show you here how I'm developing some logo designs. Logo designs for a company called Entertainer. And in this case, I'm doing it very quickly, utilizing my handy Sharpie right here. And I'm using my Sharpie to just quickly sketch out some different brand identities, some different logos for the company called Entertainer, which deals with television and interactive content. Okay? So go ahead, Scott, and advance on to the next frame. Here's some examples of some other solutions for the Entertainer logo. The one they ended up going with is in the upper left-hand corner. The upper left-hand corner was the outline of a TV screen that wraps around the outside of the television and then hooks into the screen area with the letter I, which is the first letter in their name, Entertainer. And then as we advance on to the next frame, you can see how it's worked in. You can see how the Entertainer logo, oh, sorry, Scott, I'm getting a little cut off here. Let's see.
Do you need me to go back?
No, I got it. Okay. If you click on the Entertainer image, it'll go full screen and you can see the logo in the lower part of the screen. And you can see how the idea is to be able to brand the service with their logo mark. In this case, the Entertainer brand. And then Scott, if you could advance on to the next one. Very good. And here's an example of a warm palette. The previous one offered a cool palette, meaning it was blues, yet greens and violets. And then we have a warm palette with reds, oranges, and yellows. Okay. All right. And with that, I'm going to go to my overhead view, Scott, we're going to talk a little bit about drawing a little storyboard here, okay? So the first thing I want you guys to do, if you're going to follow along, and by the way, you don't have to follow along. I'm just going to do it, and then you can just tell me, you know, if you need me to slow down or speed up, and you'll learn how to draw a storyboard here, okay? In this case, I'm going to teach a little bit about typography first. Typography, as you can see here, is basically broken down into two types of character design for your type. The first one is called a serif font. That's this collection right here. And I've typed out Tater's name in different examples of what his type will look like in a serif font. Serifs are these little areas on the edge and bottom of characters that flare out. They flare out and they create a little different look on the character, okay? So you'll notice that these have little, if you can see at the bottom of the R, has a little line across the bottom of it. You can see it there. That's called a serif, okay? And there are a whole collection of typefaces that are in the serif family, okay? Serif is a French word and it means flare, to flare out, to flare the bottom of the letter form out, okay? Then there's also a set of typography that involves a sans serif. In French, the word sans means without. So that means these typefaces do not have that flare. They're a sans serif, without serif, okay? And as you can see, these letter forms, like the R, doesn't have any line on the bottom of it, unlike these over here that have a line on the bottom of it. And that's a different type of type design. So typically in typography, typefaces or different types of fonts are laid out in either sans serif or serif, okay? And these are important things to know because when you go to do a brand, some brand personalities like to have a little flair. You know, they like to have a little form of an accent or something like that. Other brands want to have a very staid and very professional kind of presentation. And so they typically rely on the sans serif. Whereas the more playful kids programs will probably rely more on the serif as an example, okay? So those are important things to know. Once you have a 3-frame storyboard set up, I'm going to teach you how to draw letter forms here. So I'm going to draw some serif fonts as an example. So I'll just put here serif. Okay. So serif forms are typically laid out. You lay out some construction lines like this. Okay. And you can draw the vertical strokes first. I'm gonna write out the name Tater, okay? So I can draw the vertical strokes first. That's gonna be a T. This is gonna be an A. This is gonna be another T. This is going to be an E. And this is gonna be an R. So those are the vertical strokes. Now watch what happens when I put the horizontal strokes in. You see what happens there? You now have a typographical form, okay? So moving up into our storyboard, I know that the end frame is going to be Tater's name. So I'm just going to fill that in very quickly. I've already drawn the vertical forms. I'm going to quickly draw in the other parts of the letter forms. And now I know what the end of our animation is going to be. Now, the way that I'm going to design this animation is I'm going to take Tater's name here, and I'm going to turn it on end like this. And I'm going to let it fall into place like this. So it's going to start on end like this. It's going to come down, and it's going to fall into place like that. Now, how do you describe that motion to an animator? Well, you do it in a storyboard, and you've got to draw the start frame, the middle frame, and the end frame, like that. Now the end frame is already done. So now I need to draw in the other frames. So I'm going to start with the start frame first, which is the on edge frame, like this. So I'm going to draw in some perspective lines, like this. Okay, because that gives me an idea of what the box, the general box, is going to look like. And then I'm going to draw in the other middle frames. And as you can see, the box is starting on edge and flipping around. So I draw a little note to myself up in the top saying a fast flip going on here. And then it's going to start to ease out and eventually end up at its end form like that. So I'm going to start by drawing in those construction lines first. You're going to give me some outline. Then I'm going to put in the letter forms. So I'm going to start with Tater's name. And as you can see, I'm staying close to the perspective lines. So there's Tater's name on edge. It's on edge like this, looking kind of down at it, and it's going to slide in like this, okay? So I'm going to continue that in my next frame. So I'm going to draw the T, always being mindful of the perspective lines. And as you can see, I'm just slowly drawing each character. And again, being respectful of the perspective lines, getting closer and closer to how the animation is going to work. So you can see that the animation in this storyboard starts with the word Tater on end here in perspective. Then it comes away from the camera, starts to turn, and then ends right here. See how that works? So with that storyboard, I can describe this animation to an animator, somebody who's actually going to animate this in the computer. This is the motion that I want. And the storyboard gives the beginning frame, the middle frame, and the end frame of what the animation is going to look like. Okay? So as I said up here, I'm going to have it flipping down quickly, and I draw myself a little circular arrow, giving the animator the understanding that the piece is flipping. Then it's going to start to ease out, and it's going to get flatter and flatter to the camera, and eventually it's going to be directly looking straight on the camera with the name Tater as the brand. Okay? And that's what we call a storyboard. And those storyboards become very, very handy when you're telling an animator how they want to draw. So a good exercise you guys can work on is take your name, and think of how you can create a very small 2 to 3 second animation that creatively brings on your name so that you can actually like communicate to others, my name is Liliana, and this is a little bit about me. I'm going to playfully bring in my name and show you how it tells a little story about my personality. Okay? So with that, I'm going to leave this tape down, leave it for reference. And Scott, you can leave it up as one of the screens, but we're going to go back to the imagery, and I'm going to talk to you about one last brand that I want you to think about. And Scott, you can make the TiVo brand the main image on the screen. There you go. Very nice. So I don't know whether you guys are familiar with TiVo. So TiVo is a product actually, but it was the first product that allowed you to digitally record programs. And we were lucky enough to be asked to design the brand and the identity for TiVo. So what you're seeing here on the screen now is what we were given. They had already established the name. They were originally called Teleworld. Teleworld was their original name. And between the Teleworld folks and myself and my team, we came up with the abbreviated name called TiVo. And with TiVo, we started to create an identity. That first identity is over on the right-hand side of the screen. It was a little, what we called the TiVo man, which was basically a television screen with old rabbit ears, antenna, and some legs. And we wanted to create this character called TiVo. So with that, we took the TiVo brand and we continued to work with it to try to get a character that was a little more playful. And Scott, you can move on to the next example. And we came up with this. So we combined the TiVo logo type, the TIVO, with the character itself, and then gave it a smile underneath. So the combined logo type, the TIVO, and the logo mark, the TiVo man, became one. And this is a good, successful use of logo type and logo mark combined to make a brand, the TiVo brand. And then we started to explore, how do we make a character of this guy? How do we make him something that'll be memorable to people? Because he's going to have kind of a playful, irreverent kind of personality. So we started to look at, what does this object look like in all dimensions? So go ahead and advance to the next frame. And you can start to see, we took a front view of this character and made him three-dimensional. And then we turned him on his side so we could see what he would look like from the side. And then we turned him all the way around so we could see what he looks like at the back in the back. And as you can see, he's quite a playful character. He's not your CBSI brand, but rather a more playful character who doesn't take himself so seriously. Whereas CBS, being a longtime trusted brand on television, wants to be very serious in their presentation. TiVo was kind of a new to the market and kind of playful in the way that he wanted to be presented. So we created this TiVo character. And with that, Scott, we can move on to the next frame. We started to give him some personality here. So these are sketches I did in very, very quick form with a Sharpie that just kind of play off of, what is this TiVo character and what does he do? In this case, we were exploring, how can we tell the audience that they need to wait a minute for a file to download? Because this was the introduction of the internet. And at that time, it took a long time for internet files to come down to your computer so that you could play them back in real time and actually see them. So we came up with some characters dealing with the TiVo brand that explored the idea of being able to wait, be able to work on the loading. Sometimes now you'll see the word loading, or you'll see a spinning beach ball, or you'll see dots, or you'll see a radar kind of animation. Those are all animations for waiting for a file to download. So quickly go on through these. We can advance to the next one. Here he is acting as a director in a director's chair, and he's standing by waiting for the crew to get started. Next one. Here he is, he gets off his chair and he goes, okay guys, I'm gonna pick up my bullhorn here in a minute if you don't get started. And then we can go on to the next one. An example where he goes, okay, I can only balance these three balls for a little while. So let's hurry up and get that file down. Then we go on to the next one. Here he is holding a clock and he's going, come on, let's get this file down. It's taking a little while, but be patient. Okay, and with that, oh, yep, and the last one was he's spinning a basketball on his finger. That can only happen for so long. So he'll spin that basketball while he waits for the file to come down. You can see how I give the character, you know, some kind of playful aspects by kicking his knee out and throwing him off balance a little bit, just something to kind of make him a little more playful, okay? And with that, Scott, we're going to move on to some animation files. I want you to see how this brand started to work into an animation that is going to allow the service, the TiVo service, to launch and to be in people's homes, okay? So with that, take a look at file 24. This is a motion file, guys. And Scott, if you could play that again. Here he is. Our animation character, the TiVo man. And the TiVo man was always with a character of a playful character. And he's basically working behind your TV, inside your TV. He's working very hard on your behalf. He's getting all these programs lined up and saved and organized. And we wanted to show that this little guy is working around the clock behind your screen to bring you your television. Okay, and Scott, we can move on to file 25. Here are some other animations on what this character looks like and the things he's able to do. So those are, go ahead and play that again, Scott. So these are just some small little animations that talk about the character of TiVo. These are called motion tests. These are tests that I do with the animators to look at what they look like. They're what we call low resolution, meaning they're very pixelated. They're very rough and they're kind of coarse. Go ahead and play it again, Scott. Yep. We came up with the idea that TiVo has a bunch of balls, and those balls are programs. They're program balls. And he's busy all the time rounding up and gathering these programming balls for your viewing pleasure. So we thought of ways to play off this idea, this conceptual idea that he has all these programs that he's juggling all the time, but he's always getting them ready for you to watch. Okay, and then Scott, moving on to file 26. These are what we call loopable backgrounds. So you can see that the type, that it says TiVo Central, brought to you by Philips. And what happens is we create this animation that is using a cycle. If you guys remember when we moved back a long time ago, we were busy doing a fly cycle. Do you remember the fly cycle, the bird that was flying? Well, we can create cycles with typography, meaning that the beginning and end can hook up seamlessly, and you can let them loop as if they go on forever. But really, all it is a short animation that has a beginning and an end that are exactly the same, thereby they can loop. And we came up with these loopable backgrounds. Okay, Scott, you can go on to the next one. Here's another one. You can see how the typography in the top moves and dissolves and fades, but it feels like it's always moving. We call these living backgrounds. Okay, and then Scott, the final animation that I'm going to share with you is a little promo animation where you can see how we use typography and program labels to basically show what's coming up, what the HBO showcase is going to be this week. Isn't that cool? Okay, guys, let's go ahead and go back, Scott, to the down shooter. So guys, I just wanted to reiterate to you that all of those animations that you saw require a storyboard, okay? And that storyboard has to have at least 3 frames, a beginning frame, a middle frame, and an end frame. And in the case of graphics, we often put things in perspective, meaning that we turn objects in their 3-dimensional space so that you can use all aspects of spatial dimension to tell your story, okay? And that involves typography, both serif and sans serif fonts, and it also involves motion. And in order to do the motion, you have to be able to describe how that motion works. Best way to do that is in a storyboard, okay? So with that, I'm going to open it up. Let Liliana, Heather, and Tater, if you're still on, feel free to share, you guys, or ask me any questions. Liliana, Heather, you guys can ask questions or share. It's up to you. Okay, do you guys want to share something, Liliana or Heather?
They said in the chat we don't have anything yet.
Okay, understood. Maybe next week you guys can have something to share. It's, believe me, you don't have to share. If you don't have anything to share, it's no big deal. It's totally fine. No problem. How about any questions? Do you guys have any questions? It's okay if you don't have any questions too. That's totally fine. So with that, guys, I'm going to let you know that we're going to continue to talk about broadcast graphics for the rest of the month, at least in my class, on my Thursday class. Next week, we're going to talk about perspective drawing. How do you draw in perspective? It's really hard to do. But once you get it, it makes everything look very realistic. And it's very easy once you get some rules in place, okay? So next week, we're going to talk about perspective, being able to draw in perspective, which I started to demonstrate today, okay? All right, Scott, with that, if you have anything, please chime in. Otherwise, have fun, you guys. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week, okay?
Awesome. Thanks, Boogie.
Thank you.
Got it.
Bye,
Okay,
everyone.
take care. Bye, you guys.
Bye.